What you're about to see is a research into the politics of vaginal fluids, through which I attempt to, 1, resist the commodification of microbial health therapies, and 2, heal in both the biological and psychological sense. This is the process through which I turned, over a period of about 2 decades, my diseased, despotic body into medicine. In this space, I have gathered a series of artifacts, objects, that collectively attempt to question how we might heal when we consider health as something that's not patriarchal, that is not for profit, and that's equitable. And so I use design, I'm a designer, and I use design to craft my experiences of health that I've had otherwise, as an insurgent act not against science per se, but rather against the medical industrial complex that governs how biomedicine is practiced in the West. So I'm going to start by sharing a bit about my health. So for the past 20 years, I've had issues with my vaginal microbiome, with my vaginal flora. And essentially, I did some math for you guys. I have experienced over 64 pelvic exams, ingested over 57 doses of antifungals, 72 doses of antibiotics, and 346 doses of industrial vaginal probiotics. That's a lot. That's a lot in a lifetime. And I'm 34, so this started when I was about 17. Through this issues that I've had, so what you see here, for example, is what when you look into a microscope and you look at vaginal fluids of someone that's has a very healthy flora, this is what it looks like, and then on the right-hand side, what it looks like when you have bacterial vaginosis. And the different types of issues and healthcare issues you can have with your vagina that are related to the microbiome touch upon bacterial infections, but also fungal infections, amongst other things. But essentially, through this, I've experienced a lot of medical violence, including medical gaslighting, a lot of very inappropriate experiences with certain doctors. Not all, I've had some great ones, but I've had some really problematic ones. I've also, one of the things about BV that you experience is you have an increased risk of getting STIs and an increased risk of things like preterm birth and miscarriages. And all of these things I've experienced. So you can imagine that I'm a little bit over it, and I'm a bit sick of the system. And because I'm a designer, this is just kind of, I decided to rethink my practice. I was doing interaction design. I decided to say, fuck it, I'm gonna do something about this. So one of the things about antimicrobials that we use to treat BV and yeast infections is that we have kind of created a bigger problem for ourselves. So essentially, there is this thing that has become a big crisis called the antimicrobial resistance crisis. And essentially what happens is that the antimicrobials that we've been using and that have been kind of touted as the most important inventions in medical care in the last century have become, the microbes have become kind of used to them, and now they're becoming resistant, and so our medicine is not working anymore. And that means that we've had to kind of rethink our ways of treating these issues. One of the other things that happens and that I want you to think about is also how this is not just happening for human bodies, but it's also happening for planetary bodies, for soil bodies. And so the reason why there's some soil around you here is not because it's cute, it's really because my body, I understand my body and the soil bodies as kind of one and the same. So very kind of concretely, what happens is that all of the antibiotics we use, whether through the agricultural food system, for the animals that we consume or the plants that we want to consume, they all leach back into the earth. And now we have the same issue of antimicrobial resistance for all bodies. So this is not an issue that is just about me. It is about the entire planet. So one of the things that's really interesting as well is how biomedicine actually fails to account for how health is an interdependent relationship between species. So what's interesting in kind of like the recent research that's come about is how we basically discovered a new organ in the human body, and that's called the microbiome. And the microbiome is the collection of bacteria, of viruses, of fungi, and other little critters that exist in and on your body, and that contribute to processes of health, right? So in the last, I would say, 20 years, there's been a lot of research that came about around this. And there's a lot of research that has been dedicated to mapping these microbes, understanding what does it look like, who are these species when we are in a healthy state, and what are these species when we're in an unhealthy state. However, what it doesn't very much do is kind of understand the relationships, which is a bit of a problem. It's very about like making lists, essentially. One thing we do know, however, is that a healthy vaginal microbiome has, unlike other parts of the body, it has actually like main species. The difference, you maybe heard about like the gut microbiome and how diversity of microbes in the gut is really important for your health. For the vaginal microbiome, it's different. You basically want to have a prevalence of lactobacillus strains. So, for example, there's Lactobacillus crispidus, which is very kind of an important bacteria there. And these bacteria, they produce lactic acid, and what that means is that the vaginal pH is about, when it's in a healthy state, goes up to about 4.5. And over that, we can kind of test and have an idea of like if you might have bacterial vaginosis, for example. Because if you have a different kind of species community in there, and usually a higher diversity of species, what'll happen is that your vaginal pH will go up. So we have all these like very simple, like pH testing is really easy. You can do it with water. It's like something you can buy at the store. It's very easy to do this. But hasn't been easy was mapping this entire microbiome of the whole body. But one of the things that kind of came about, not only the antimicrobial resistance crisis, but being able to map out these microbes in the body in a way that we've never been able to before. And by the way, it's with like genome sequencing, so you need all these big fancy machines. And but now that we've been able to kind of map this out, we've developed all these new therapies called microbiome transplants. And maybe you've heard about poop transplants, so fecal matter transplants, where they will collect the stools, the poop, from a person who has a very healthy gut, and then they will transform that into, well, they're just packaging it so we can re-ingest it or put it in another person's body. And we use that for, let's say, irritable bowel syndrome, but also for many, many other things. And the health of your microbiome is so important that there's so many research coming out around how it's linked to things like autism, to depression, to anxiety. And honestly, the list goes on. There's stuff around cancers, it just really never ends. So this is a kind of a really big thing. This became a kind of new frontier for the medical system. And these therapies, so on the top you have the poop transplant, and on the bottom you have, it's a schematic that comes from the first paper published a couple of years ago about vaginal microbiome transplants. So I've been researching microbes for a very long time, longish time. So when I saw this paper for the first time, I freaked out because I thought, holy shit, I can actually maybe do this, you know, it's just exchanging microbes. And start looking into this and reading up about it and being very excited, thinking, wow, these scientists are trying to make this accessible, and you know, of course, that's very laudable. However, that's actually not how things are turned out. So what's actually going on right now with the human microbiome market is essentially that there's a lot of money to be made. So this market is now kind of poised to reach about $1.7 billion by 2029. There's a lot of money to be made from your poop, from your vaginal fluids, from your spit, from all that stuff that's in your body. And there's not a lot of like regulation, or like there is, but it's a bit tricky because it's considered waste, right? You don't think of your poop or your vaginal fluids as this medicine. So one of the things that's actually driving the kind of growth the growth of demand of this whole market is essentially like personalized medicine, and we all want these kind of natural and holistic approaches. But really what's really helping this whole thing is that there's a collaboration between the industry and academia currently, where they're developing microbiome research together. So what happens is that they're leveraging the expertise from both, but essentially what it looks like is that you have funds from the industry that's coming from there, and that is supporting all this microbiome research in academia that's supposed to be impartial, et cetera, et cetera. So really what drives the development of these therapies that are supposedly going to change everything, really huge game changers, and going to change, you know, like people with vaginas, who, like, there's gonna change their lives. It's essentially the ability of translating all of this into profitable healthcare solutions. And if you have done a little bit of like reading upon like the political theory around healthcare and politics, is essentially there's a huge problem if you try to make healthcare profitable, because you're putting the actual care in kind of the last kind of priority. So that's a big problem. So essentially these venture capitalists are funding biotech companies, and then you have these major companies that are like Pfizer, that are involved in all of this funding. So it's not this, you know, beautiful little world where everything is going to end up accessible to the people that need it the most. So here I want to show you the patent, one of many patents. It's actually exhibited there if you want to have a look through it, that 3 researchers have filed on behalf of Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. This is about transplanting, using cervical vaginal secretions, which essentially translates to your vagina's fluids, to using them for the treatment of bacterial vaginosis. And what this means is that no one is allowed to reproduce, do, or in any shape or form, this practice. It is illegal to do that. And this is a patent that has been filed internationally. So it's not just in the US, for example. They also have a patent in the US, but this is a general patent. And patents are essentially the mechanisms through which industry leaders in biomedicine will drive profit, because that's essentially, they have like what's called intellectual property portfolios. So if you go on the websites of these different companies, this is the kind of language that they use, and patents are a part of this, and this is how they will end up making their money. And one of the things that's particular about fluids that are super microbial is that it can be quite dangerous. There's a lot of like things to consider in order to make it safe for one person to transplant their fluids into another person's body. And one of the particularities of this is that it's also like, it's very compounded by the fact that there's all these very lengthy approval processes and really high costs and really high stringent requirements to get all of this clinically approved so that you have your clinical trials approved. And a lot of these, so there's a lot of kind of lobbying for specific types of rules and regulatory practices. And that what happens is that not only does it hinder kind of the development of the launch of these products and therapies, but it essentially allows the big players to gain the share of the market and these smaller kind of biotech companies to never really stand a chance. So that also reduces kind of the opportunity for competition to exist and for things to be a little bit more affordable. So when I've been doing this research, you know, like I have been reading and following the work of these researchers for years and being really excited to see like the whole process and how they're developing everything, and then realizing that in the end, these people all work for different companies. One of them is Freya Biosciences, based in Denmark, and then another one is from Pfizer, and another one is from this place. So it's really difficult to believe that this is going to be made accessible for people. So what I'm saying is that biomes are commons and they are not commodities, and we should not treat them as such. And I want us to consider here the framing of microbial health as a facet of social health equity. And that's really important because vaginal microbiome transplants and all the other microbiome transplants therapies They're being developed on the basis of commercialization and profit. And these are not efforts that are aimed at accessibility. And so when we talk about all of this, we have to remember that microbial health is clearly central to human and planetary health, but who's kind of disproportionately affected by poor microbial health is essentially marginalized communities. And that's essentially related to socioeconomic conditions. For example, there are, in the US, when you look at the data, it's not just the US, also North America, so it will be Black and Hispanic women that have significantly higher prevalence of bacterial vaginosis than other groups, which means also that risk of contracting STIs and preterm birth is very, very high in those groups as well. And specifically HIV is very contractable when you have BV. So it's a pretty serious thing to consider. So what I'm interested in and what I've been kind of attempting to do is to unbox the black box, essentially, is trying to figure out how do the material conditions of this thing kind of perpetuate microbial health inequity? How can I undo with design how it's currently being done, unpack it, and then redo it in a way that goes against these things? And I think I go about it a bit naively, just thinking I can actually do it, and then I just try. So, I use essentially design as a kind of medium to reform these experiences, and especially my own experiences. So it's not just about making it accessible, but also I try to heal my own body, and I try to heal also all of this kind of really tricky experiences I had with bad doctors and, you know, being screamed at, having improper pelvic tests that should not have happened, you know, comments about my underwear, other things like that. And so when I think of design, like the reason, I don't know, I'm a designer, that's kind of the language through which I talk, and I kind of see, like, you know, we design the world, and then in return, kind of the designs that we do kind of like design us. So the way that I think about it is like, if I shape things differently, if I make it differently, and if we practice it differently, then we are enacting something different, and we're fighting against that. So I don't know if I could say that I'm such a huge activist, you know, in the front lines kind of person, but through this kind of practice, it's what I attempt to do. So what you're looking at right now is kind of, the work is a two-part thing. The first part is developing kind of an open source protocol for doing vaginal microbiome transplants, where antibiotics are not needed, where antifungals are not needed. And it's important to note that so far, these antimicrobials are always used in the process. And I have been kind of structuring this in a way that removes the use of antimicrobials, because my hypothesis is that it kind of goes against the very idea of what we're trying to do with microbiome transplants. And finally, that it would work. And recently, about 3 months ago, a paper just came out actually supporting this. So sometimes you might not be a scientist, but, you know, doesn't mean you're full of shit. So one of the things that I want to note, though, is that this is not something you can do in kind of like watching a 5-minute YouTube video. It's pretty complex, you know? It's not the easiest thing to do, and it requires a lot of care. And doing this is like incredibly big responsibility to take on, because it means that you can make someone sick, because it means that you can make yourself sick. So there's a lot of learning and understanding that's involved, but through the process of doing this, you learn and you are empowered by that knowledge, because suddenly the black box is not there anymore. It actually ends up being quite simple, because essentially it's just facilitating a flow of microbes from one body to another. And another thing that that through this kind of practice I've had to do is actually play scientist a lot. I managed, thank you to the Arts Council, because I got a microscope with the Arts Council money. and I can actually validate and see what's going on in there. So these are captures of the first time I've ever seen my own microbes with my eyes. This really long strain that you see there is a strain of lactobacillus. It's perhaps the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in like the last year. I'm really excited to show you this. But it's basically that I've been kind of collecting my own fluids for the past months and analyzing them and watching them and learning and trying to test the pH, look at what's in there, trying to turn all of this material into essentially a medicine. Because I cannot get over my experiences until I turn my body into actual medicine, into something that is remedial, as opposed to something that has just been diseased, that has been a source of pain, of shame, and of frustration. So the objects the second part of the thing, the way that I work is also to reflect through the kind of the objects and the material culture that exists in science, and especially in microbiology. I am not really proud to say, but I failed all of my science classes when I started doing them. I really preferred drawing instead. So that's how I ended up in design. But essentially, one of the things I loved a lot was biology. And so I guess, I don't know, it all turned out really quite well for me. But one of the things I like to do is also reflect on the aesthetic, kind of the language, aesthetic language, the shapes, the textures, the materials that exist in microbiology and why. So I collaborate with a scientific glassblower from, in this case, from the University of Oslo in the chemistry department, who's also an artist, to kind of reshape and reform what all these tools could be like. So what you have here is a collection of essentially collection tools that you insert in the vagina to collect the fluids. There's vessels that contain saline solution, which is basically just distilled water with salt. It's really not more than that I make myself. There's a jar to kind of collect and clean all the tools, and then there's pipettes that we created that are marked at exactly the 1 milliliter mark, so that we can reinsert the fluids at a later time and use them to kind of, to reestablish the community of microbes. And so essentially what I'm doing is I'm using my own fluids and turning them into the medicine that, you know, all these doses that I kind of mentioned and like enumerated to you, instead of trying to replace this with my own fluids. And I think one thing we have to remember is in a way, it's like I am my best kind of donor of fluids, and that kind of reduces also the risk of contracting different things. But there are definitely ways to do it amongst people to address this. And one of the things I specifically would love to show you here is there's 5 different types of clays around that kind of hold these like little elixir vials of my fluids. Yes, these are my vaginal fluids right here for you to look at. And it's organized quite seriously around the kind of my menstrual cycle from the last month and the day at which I kind of collected the fluids. And the reason why I do that is because there's actually a really interesting mapping of how throughout the month your vaginal microbiome shifts and changes. And when you start to ovulate, your fluids get really kind of watery, and it's like perfect time to collect, because it's just like you're producing all of this like fluids, and I was just like, yes, so much. And I could actually tell that there's a difference between like, I'm gonna have my period in 2 days, it's not going well, and like I figured out when I was ovulating actually through doing this. And so I have all these clays that I also work a lot with soil, of course, because I consider soil health very important. And so these are all soils that I've foraged from different places where I've kind of started to develop the work. In Oka, back home in Canada, on a strip of a beach that's like considered like the queer beach, which is important for me because I'm queer. Another one is in Italy, because I was spending some time there, and we went to this beautiful site, you know, this old like 800-year-old vineyard that had never had any like pesticides or anything there, so I got some clay from there. And also in Norway, where I live now, which is an important place for me. So they're all organized through this. And yeah, so I invite you to kind of look at these objects and to consider also the shape as well is based off of what's called an aliquot. And it's kind of like these test tubes that we use in microbiology. And I wanted to kind of think about how we shape something that is so industrial, so reproduced, but that meets this idea of the elixir. Like if my fluids become like the source of life and the source of care and remediality, like somehow I can undo all of this pain. So what I kind of have been developing is the idea that insurgent skinships, when we develop insurgent skinships, when we co-heal with each other, when we enact microbial health solidarity with others. And we do this through what's called a transhack feminist approach of microbiome transplants. So instead of doing it the normal way, we hack, and we hack with care. So to end, I want to read you the protocol that I put together while I play a video of me struggling to do this. And just the kind of the back end of, because this can look very easy, but I really want you to see the kind of all the steps, all the messiness, me trying to learn how to do gram staining so I can see the microbes better and whatnot. I collect my vaginal fluids 3 days after the last day of my period. The best time is around ovulation, when the vagina produces more watery cervicovaginal fluids. I collect more fluids during those days because of this. Before collecting, I make sure to match all of the points on the safety checklist. That I don't have any microbial infections, that I've abstained from activities in which sperm could have gotten mixed in my vaginal fluids in the 10 days before collection, that I'm STI-free and generally in good health, and haven't used antimicrobials or intravaginal products in the last 20 days. I sterilize a menstrual disc in boiling water for 10 minutes, letting it cool down before insertion. I wash my hands, then insert the menstrual disc in my vagina. I leave it there for about 4 to 6 hours. In preparation for the next step, I sterilize a tube with either white vinegar or rubbing alcohol and wait until it's fully dry. I weigh the empty tube and note down the weight. Before removing the disc, I wash my hands again. Then I take it out slowly, keeping the fluids on the disc, and I put the disc in the tube. At this point, I make sure all of the surfaces I'm about to work on and all the tools I will use are clean and sterile. I wear a mask and gloves so that I'm sure that the only microbes I'm collecting are from my vagina. I swab a bit of fluids onto a cotton swab and dab it onto pH-sensitive paper to check that the pH levels are within 3.5 and 4.5. This indicates an unlikelihood of bacterial vaginosis. I swab a small quantity of fluids onto a microscope plate. I stain the fluids using crystal violet and safranin dyes and iodine. Staining them makes them much more visible, and I use a drawing I found online to help me understand what I see and spot the lactobacillus or the strains like Prevotella or Gardnerella that would mean that the fluids are unsafe for transplant use. I insert the collection tube in a homemade centrifuge, which consists of a custom 3D printed part I insert into a drill, like a drill bit. I've made the 3D printed part downloadable online for free. If I didn't have access to a 3D printer though, I could hack a salad spinner into a centrifuge to separate the fluids. I centrifuge until most of the fluids are at the bottom of the tube, and then I carefully take out the menstrual disc. I weigh the fluids by subtracting the weight of the tube. Then, I dilute the fluids by adding the calculated amount of saline solution, mix it with a needle to homogenize everything as much as possible, or shake it vigorously. For each milligram of fluids I've collected, I add 0.0025 milliliters of sterile saline solution, which I previously made by mixing 1 liter of distilled water with 9 grams of salt. I separate and transfer the mix evenly into 0.5 milliliter vials. Each dose should have a minimum of about 0.7 milliliter fluids. When it's time to transplant, I will use 4 vials for the necessary 2 doses. And then I store the final doses in my kitchen freezer and use them within the next 6 months. And when I transplant, I have to take 2 doses. The second dose is taken 2 to 3 days after the first one. I thaw 2 vials in the fridge. Once the fluids are thawed, I use a long pipette to gather the fluids. And I sit on my bathroom floor. Sometimes I lie down. And I do it so that I can comfortably place the pipette inside my vagina. About 20 drops of fluids go inside. And then I lie flat for about 15 minutes to let the fluids coat my insides. And then I do that again 2 to 3 days later. Thank you.
So, Serina, because this is sort of a result of your very long-term practice, so you've been working with this question of microbiome before. It was part of your MA project, and where you sort of worked with sharing lung microbiome. And what I'm really interested in is that you always mention that you need to that you consulted scientists or specialists to sort of help you to develop these processes. And I'm sort of asking whether you see this process, what is the applicability of these methods if you don't have access to, could you do it without a scientist? Or, is this when we think about these black box knowledge, so if you are a person who suffers from dysbiosis or any sort of illnesses, how we can get away from this notion of relying in the end on experts and on biotechnologies, or is this possible, or whether this is something that we need to always consider, that there has to be at the beginning someone who consults this whole process with people who are actually scientists. Maybe this is a tricky question, but that was something that has been bugging me a lot. Can we actually avoid this sort of, or not avoid, but yeah.
That's a really good question, because sometimes I think would I ever be able to do all of this work if I hadn't had access to all these papers that were all produced by these academics that are funded by all the, it's this kind of chain. But at the same time, I think, unboxing the black box is one thing, but I think the real issue is not so much should we not have science, or because that ends up being that question, and I don't think that's the thing. It's more about what is an ethical way of doing this, and I think that's kind of not something that is necessarily there isn't really a lot of space for scientists to really think outside of this and to be quite subversive. A lot of the microbiologists I collaborate with, essentially they work in hospitals, and there isn't time to think about this stuff. And then because all of this is kind of tied into the ways in which we finance research as well. But I really don't think it would be possible to do any of this without the really great work that a lot of scientists are doing. I think but that's not, to me, that's not the worry or issue, because I really see us as kind of very complementary in that way. It's more about what are your motivations when you're putting out this work, and who are you stopping from doing this practice? The problem is not the paper coming out, the problem is the patent. So technically, well, I don't know, maybe not technically, but literally it's illegal for me to do this, So that's, for me, that's the problem.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so if we would you see this process that we sort of witnessed here, would you think that this is something you could share to other people as a community-based knowledge, or do you see this as because of course we don't have time and means to access and what you have as a researcher and designer, So just what would be the next step if we wanted to like think about like distribution of this sort of methods to like a community or like so what are your ideas, because you had to do it a little bit with your previous project, so maybe you can talk a little bit about this, and then I would kind of open after, you can kind of, whoever wants to ask any questions, you can continue.
Well, for me, the next step is clearly like, now that I have this microscope, I feel like I can do anything, you know, like, I feel like I can. So I teach a lot, and I like to kind of, you know, hope that like the students I have can somehow be infected with my ideas. But I did have one student that was what's her title? It was like a pharmaceutical engineer, and she came to the Design Academy, and she was really excited about similar things as me, and she kind of created this DIY recipe to test, to make a growth medium to test out for one of the specific strains that I was talking about, which is very, very cool. So it's kind of like a very slow work for each and every single step to try to find the DIY version that you can do at home. And it's tricky because it's not something like it's not something you can just do like after watching a 5-minute YouTube video. But one thing that I am planning to do now is to actually use the microscope or the kind of knowledges that I've learned to kind of run these kind of not microscope gazing activities, but that suddenly we can all kind of look into the microscope to our fluids and see what we have, you know. And I think that's actually really powerful in terms of detection tool that's free, that's accessible, and not only that, but when you learn to do that, you kind of gain a lot of agency and understanding about the microbiome itself, and then what you can do to kind of address these kind of issues. So the idea is that I kind of want to make this available as a resource to at least the community that's at AHO where I'm working and around Oslo. Because this is something that requires a certain proximity as well. So so it's really about just doing this locally with other people, which kind of is something that's started a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Oh. Okay. Cool. So I would have some questions maybe about art, but I would let other people to ask, because we kind of like maybe more people will come. So I want to pass onto the audience if anybody has a question.
Hi. Hello. I'm kind of like thinking about what Hannah said, is that I think kind of in contemporary society, like it's a real challenge on like what should be made available and accessible, and what is empowering in terms of like deciding on your own body, like bodily autonomy. And on the other hand, like kind of I feel like there's a thin line between this, like kind of having like agency over your own body and understanding that usually is kind of, you know, left to, you know, medical professionals or whoever. And then kind of, you know, different kinds of, you know, almost like disinformation kind of strategies that, you know, like, I think also like people that are, you know, against, you know, vaccination, they kind of, it's framed as, narrative can also be framed as, you know, I'm taking agency over my body. That kind of the narratives around very different practices can be kind of similar. And I'm just wondering if you know, think about this, and what your thoughts would be on this.
Actually, there's one kind of very good example. Like when you have like chronic and like constant vaginal infections like I've had, it's like you go a little crazy because it's really like there's nothing you can do. The pills aren't working. The doctors don't really give a shit, and it's like, well, I can give you more antibiotics or more antifungals, and then you start scouring the internet because you're like everything's itching, and like the only thing that will like stop it from itching is taking a bath, literally, like just sitting in water. And then you're not going to spend your whole life sitting in a bath, like, and then you're scouring the internet and you see all these like forums, like I use garlic and I put it up my vagina. I use like maybe less like dramatic, like yogurt up my, which makes no sense, because in the end, what's cool about science is that you can really kind of see which bacteria are in there, and then you realize, oh, actually, in my vagina, it's not this type of lactobacillus strain that's in yogurt. It's completely different. So really, when I'm doing that, or when I'm it's so different than like even prebiotics and probiotics, which are like not maybe the most kind of efficient ways either to kind of deal with this. But I think for me, it's not. I'm very kind of critical and like sometimes doubtful when I read a lot of these scientific papers, but I read all of them. I know more about the vaginal microbiome than most doctors. Like, not even a joke. Like, this is like words from doctors. And that's just because I have like really spent a lot of time and care in reading up on all of this. And I think for me, I think everyone's entitled to kind of like, their perception and their experiences and everything. And I can understand that like you are really disillusioned by the system. And what I've done with the disillusionment is this, this is what I've done. Because I do think that it's tricky to kind of ignore like how, yes, we have the antimicrobial resistance crisis, but also we've eradicated like through vaccines, all these like really huge diseases that we would have, like half of us would not be here if these diseases were still there. So I think there's also kind of these things to consider and think about, and these are all, like there's a lot of robust kind of research and science behind it. So I don't know, I think the disillusionment is very real in the world. It's very real, and I understand.
And I feel like often it comes from like also chronic illness, where like the research on chronicity and how to deal with it is so like beginning, yeah. Thank you.
But just to say, like, it's not also to shame someone in that process. Like, I think that's also very important to be careful of, because I don't want to shame anyone for their opinions. I just want us to kind of like sit down and do research and think about it, and and I understand that people don't have the time like that I've invested in. I've put so much time in this. I really literally found a way to get paid to do this. Like, it took years, but like I managed, So I get that like what I knew when I wasn't getting paid to do this is very different than what I know now. And it takes, it's a practice. It's like a craft, It's not something that you learn overnight.
I still have one question. Like but if anyone wants, please.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, well, my question is that if a person is basically ill and he cannot sample his own liquid that's healthy, he has to find a donor. And I also wondered how efficient is it, because you take your own sample and you put it back in. So if you are healthy already, do you use it when you are not well?
Yeah, so two things. The reason why I do the self-transplant, first and foremost, is because there's a lot of things I can control with that, and I have access, full access to the material. The other thing is also, because this is illegal, and also me practicing medicine is illegal. I mean, I don't know about here, but definitely back home in Canada. So I'm always trying to, I don't know, how do I do this without getting thrown in jail, and then can still make the points that I want to make. So I think it's so basically the way that it works is that in the greatest of dreams, this is something we do collectively, And when we do it collectively, it implies all these things. Like, it implies realizing that you can really get someone sick. So you know, in the words of the great RuPaul, don't fuck it up. It's like, you better not mess it up. So you have to be super you have to put in the time and the care. And that's why healthcare is like, you know, there's all these cuts in healthcare because, and then it's falling apart is because you can't cut in healthcare. You can't cut in the time. You can make it slightly more efficient in some ways, but it's really hard to cut in the time it takes to care. And that's the same kind of thing in this practice. Like you can absolutely do this, you know, like it's different for the gut microbiome though, because you're going with the stools and there's a lot of risk of having blood and different things in there that could be transmitted, and it's a very complex kind of environment. So I don't feel ready yet to go in there. I'm sticking with the vagina, and I also worked with the lungs as well, which is even less risky. But yeah, it's absolutely. I don't know if I answered your question, but it really requires knowing what you're doing, and that takes time. But the knowledge is there.
That was my lead-up question, basically. That if you see it in the future, if you see it as evolving into this sort of like a collective practice or some kind of a hacking activity that, you know.
Yeah, absolutely, okay. Absolutely. I would love it if it was possible, but it's definitely like I have to think a couple of times about it, because then how do you do this in a way that is because I'm not doing this just to heal my body. It's also other people's health, you know. It's a big responsibility, so you have to be kind of mindful about it. And I really do believe in this kind of the Hippocratic oath of like do no harm. It applies. There's like ethics as well when you're doing. I call this practice co-healing. You're co-healing with other people and you're co-healing with microbes, and the co is important there because it's collective, right? And in this case, I've been working with my own body, but in the case of the lung microbiome or like upper respiratory tract, it was with other people. And then this I developed with a microbiologist as well, as a support to kind of like better understand how to put together the safety checklist. Because there really is one. You have to kind of be mindful, okay, like for the upper respiratory tract, it's like I don't have a history of asthma or I don't smoke, and like these things mean that you have to take the decision like of not engaging in like a giving process. And then that's also co-healing and taking up that responsibility.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Can we take one more question, or shall we?
I'll be here all night. Yeah, I'm by experience, every time I kind of share this microbiome work, there's always, especially since I talk about my own health experiences, there's always someone that, you know, comes up to me after, oh yeah, you know what, I also had it. So I can understand these are like more private kind of conversations, but feel free to reach out. I'm happy to share all of the knowledge, all of the experiences that I've had. It should all be open source and shared with everyone. So thank you for your attention.